A millionaire finds two infants at his doorstep, but their true identities leave him in tears. The storm clawed at the windows of Diego Torres's mansion, its relentless howls slicing through the silence of the sprawling estate. Sheets of rain streaked the glass in methodical patterns, as if nature itself sought to challenge the precision of the world within. Diego stood in his study, hands tucked into his trouser pockets, his gaze fixed on the downpour. The sleek leather of his armchair gleamed in the dim light of the room, untouched, as pristine as the life he had constructed. A life free from loose ends or emotional clutter. Each corner of the house mirrored his exacting standards. The shelves were perfectly aligned, books arranged by height and hue. A delicate sculpture sat alone on a minimalist coffee table, its white curves immaculate. Not a speck of dust dared to linger. To Diego, order was not merely a preference, it was armor. He exhaled slowly, the sound blending into the faint hum of the rain, and turned back to his desk. Contracts awaited his review, their tidy stacks a small comfort amidst the chaos outside. Then, the doorbell rang. It wasn't a polite chime, but a harsh, jarring echo that shattered the tranquility. Diego froze, his brow furrowing. No one came unannounced, least of all during a storm. He checked his watch. Nearly midnight. The sound came again, insistent now, followed by a muffled knock. Diego strode toward the front door, his steps measured, purposeful. He reached it and paused, his hand hovering over the handle. Who would disturb him here at this hour? Pulling the door open, he was immediately met with the icy sting of the wind and the furious spray of rain. The sight before him was unexpected. A wicker basket sat at his feet, its surface soaked, rain pooling in its crevices. Inside, under a sodden blanket, lay two tiny forms. Diego's breath caught. He crouched slowly and peeled back the drenched fabric. Two babies, their faces pale and serene, lay bundled together as if the storm raging around them was a distant memory. His fingers hovered above the basket, the sharp cold of the rain seeping into his skin. The babies stirred faintly, their fragile chests rising and falling. Diego hesitated, his carefully composed world cracking at the edges. This was a problem that couldn't be neatly filed away or delegated. "Who?" he whispered, his voice swallowed by the storm. He glanced out into the night, squinting through the rain, searching for some sign of who might have left the basket. Nothing. Only the wind and the shadows of swaying trees. His jaw tightened. Whoever had done this was long gone. Diego's hands trembled as he lifted the basket, his grip tentative. The twins were impossibly light, like the weight of them could barely tip the scales of his controlled existence. And yet, their presence felt immense. He carried them inside, shutting the door behind him with a resolute thud. In the warm glow of the foyer, the world seemed to hold its breath. Diego set the basket on a polished console table, his movements deliberate. He retrieved a towel from a nearby closet, shaking off its stiffness, and gently began drying the babies. The silence between them was deafening, broken only by their soft breaths and the distant rumble of thunder. One of the twins stirred, a faint whimper escaping its lips. Diego froze, then leaned closer. The sound was startlingly small, but it pulled at something in him, a place he hadn't visited in years. His fingers brushed the edge of the blanket, and that's when he saw it. Initials embroidered in faded gold thread. MT. He stared at the letters, his mind grappling with memories long buried. His father's initials. A cold knot formed in his stomach. For a moment, the storm outside seemed to seep into the room, the air thick with unanswered questions. Diego inhaled deeply, trying to steady himself. The babies, oblivious to his turmoil, slept on, their tiny faces undisturbed. "What am I supposed to do with you?" he murmured, his voice a rare crack of vulnerability. The soft, rhythmic breathing of the twins filled the quiet mansion, a delicate counterpoint to the storm that had begun to ebb outside. Diego stood by the console table where he had placed the wicker basket, his arms crossed, gaze fixed on the initials embroidered in faded gold. Matsit. The letters felt heavy, as though they carried not just a name, but a weight he was unprepared to bear. His phone buzzed on the polished marble countertop. He glanced at it. A message from Valeria. "Torres, is everything prepared for the investor call tomorrow? Let me know if you need anything else tonight." Diego stared at the screen for a moment before typing back, his movements uncharacteristically hesitant. "Come to the mansion. Now." He didn't wait for a response. He tucked the phone back into his pocket and returned to the twins. One stirred, a tiny fist escaping from the swaddle of the blanket. Diego reached instinctively, his hand hovering, unsure of how to proceed. The delicate vulnerability of the gesture unnerved him. By the time Valeria arrived, the twins had begun to stir more frequently, their whimpers testing the mansion's stillness. Diego opened the door, his silhouette outlined by the dim foyer light. Valeria stood in the doorway, her usual composed demeanor faltering as she took in her boss, his shirt sleeves rolled up, hair slightly disheveled, and an unmistakable expression of uncertainty on his face. "Torres?" she asked, stepping inside cautiously. Her gaze darted to the basket on the console table. "Are those babies?" Diego closed the door behind her, his response delayed. "Yes, they were left here." Valeria's brow furrowed as she set her umbrella aside and approached the basket. She leaned over, inspecting the twins with the measured precision of someone used to solving problems. "Who left them? And why?" "I don't know," Diego replied, his voice clipped. He walked past her, pouring himself a glass of water. "That's why I called you." Her eyes flicked back to him. "You thought I would have answers." "I thought you'd know what to do," he said, the words landing somewhere between a plea and an order. Valeria turned her attention back to the babies. One of them let out a soft cry, and without hesitation, she reached down, lifting the infant with surprising ease. "We'll need formula, bottles, diapers," she murmured half to herself. The baby quieted in her arms, and Valeria rocked gently, her movements natural, instinctive. Diego watched her, his fingers tightening around his glass. "They're not staying." Valeria raised an eyebrow, but said nothing, focusing instead on adjusting the blanket around the baby. Her silence seemed heavier than any response could have been. In the kitchen, Valeria worked with brisk efficiency, sterilizing an old glass jar she'd found and filling it with warm milk. Diego hovered nearby, his usual commanding presence reduced to hesitant observation. She glanced at him, catching his distant expression. "You've never held a baby, have you?" she asked, her tone matter-of-fact. "No," he admitted. She didn't press him, but her lips curved into a faint, knowing smile. "They're lighter than they look. You might surprise yourself." He didn't respond. Instead, his gaze drifted toward the living room, where the second baby lay in the basket. The initials on the blanket caught his eye again. His hand twitched, as if drawn to the fabric. But he stopped himself, Valeria noticed. "What is it?" "Nothing," he said too quickly, turning back to her. She didn't push further, but her eyes lingered on him for a moment before she focused on the baby in her arms. "We should call someone. Child services, maybe?" Diego stiffened. His posture straightened, his jaw set. "No, they'll be taken into the system. And I won't allow that." The words came out sharper than he intended, and Valeria tilted her head, her curiosity deepening. but she didn't question him further. Later, as the house settled into an uneasy quiet, Valeria placed the twins into makeshift cradles she had fashioned from plush towels and cushions. She stood across from Diego, who leaned against the grand staircase, arms folded tightly. "You'll need to decide, Torres," she said, her voice steady but low. "This isn't something you can control with a boardroom strategy." He didn't respond immediately. His gaze lingered on the twins, their tiny forms rising and falling with each breath. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "They have my father's initials on the blanket." Valeria frowned. "Do you think it's connected?" "I don't know." His eyes darkened. "But I can't ignore it." She stepped closer, her tone softer now. "What will you do?" Diego exhaled slowly, his hand brushing against the railing as though searching for balance. The storm outside had calmed, but inside him, a new one was beginning to brew. For once in his carefully constructed life, he didn't have an answer. The once immaculate mansion had begun to unravel. Bottles lined the kitchen counter, their sterilized sheen dulled by late-night feedings. Blankets and cushions, hastily repurposed into cradles, spilled into the living room's symmetrical order. Diego Torres, usually poised and meticulous, stood in the chaos, his shirt sleeves rolled up, cradling a cup of untouched coffee. One of the twins let out a plaintive wail from the corner. Diego's shoulders tightened, his gaze flicking between his phone, its screen glowing with urgent business emails, and the source of the cry. He placed the coffee down, rubbing a hand over his face, and walked toward the makeshift cradle. "You again," he muttered under his breath, as the wail grew louder. He crouched, awkwardly patting the baby's tiny chest. "I suppose you don't care about investor meetings." The baby's cries softened, the movement of Diego's hand, clumsy but steady, providing some measure of comfort. The other twins stirred, kicking free of the blanket embroidered with the same initials that haunted him. "Mitt." He glanced at it briefly, his fingers hesitating on the fabric. He hadn't allowed himself to dig into what it meant. A knock on the front door shattered the relative quiet. Diego straightened, the interruption feeling heavier than the usual inconvenience. His steps toward the door were slow, deliberate. When he opened it, the sight before him gave him pause. A young woman stood there, rain-soaked and trembling. Her hair clung to her face, and her arms were wrapped tightly around herself as though bracing against more than just the cold. Her eyes, wide, dark, and familiar, locked onto his. "I need to speak with you," she said, her voice steady despite her disheveled state. Diego's brows furrowed, his posture stiffening. "Who are you?" The woman hesitated, her gaze flicking past him toward the sound of a baby's muffled cry. "My name is Isabel," she began, her tone wavering, but determined. "The babies, they're mine." Diego's grip tightened on the doorframe. "Excuse me." "They're mine," she repeated, stepping forward. Her voice rose, cutting through his incredulity. "And I didn't have anywhere else to leave them. You have to believe me." He studied her, his expression unreadable. She was young, mid-20s at most, but her face bore lines of exhaustion and something deeper, grief. Her resemblance to someone from his past tugged at the edges of his memory, but he couldn't place it. "Not yet. You need to leave," he said coldly, his voice clipped. "Whatever this is, I don't have time for it." "Please," Isabel said, her voice softening. "I wouldn't have come here if it wasn't my only option." Diego's response faltered. Something in her eyes, the quiet desperation, the shadow of loss, struck a nerve he wasn't prepared to confront. Against his better judgment, he stepped aside, letting her into the house. Inside, Isabel hovered near the door, her arms still crossed, as if holding herself together. Her gaze swept over the disarray. The bottles, the blankets, the faint scent of talcum powder in the air. When her eyes landed on the twins, her composure cracked. "They're okay?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Diego folded his arms. "They've survived the night." She turned to him, her expression softening. "Thank you." The words hung awkwardly between them. Diego didn't respond, instead gesturing toward the couch. Isabel sat down, gingerly, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "You said they're yours," Diego began, his tone skeptical. "But that doesn't explain why they were left on my doorstep." Isabel's shoulders tensed. She looked down at her hands, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of her sleeve. "My mother died recently. It was a car accident. And their father—" She paused, inhaling sharply. "He was killed." Diego's jaw tightened. "Killed." "He tried to protect us," she said, her voice trembling. "There are people. Dangerous people. They've been after us since the twins were born." The room felt heavier, the air thick with implications Diego wasn't ready to acknowledge. "And you thought bringing them here, into my house, was the safest option?" "Yes." Her eyes met his, steady despite the cracks in her voice. "You don't understand. They're not safe anywhere else. But you're their only chance." Diego frowned, the weight of her words pressing against his calculated indifference. "Why me?" Isabel hesitated again, her gaze flicking toward the twins. "Because of who you are, and because of who I am." He stiffened, his mind turning over the unspoken connection. "Explain." "My father," she said finally, her voice breaking the silence. "His name was Miguel Torres." The room seemed to tilt. Diego stepped back, his hand brushing against the wall as if to steady himself. Miguel. A name he hadn't spoken in years. A name buried in the rubble of his estranged family. His younger brother. Isabel's eyes softened, though her voice grew firm. "They're safer with you. I don't know for how long, but for now it's the only way." Before Diego could respond, she rose, her movements abrupt. "I'll be back," she said, her tone resolute, "but you need to keep them safe." Diego watched as she left, her parting words lingering in the air. "You don't know how dangerous this is." The house was quiet, but Diego's mind was not. Isabel's parting words, "You're the only family they have left," echoed in his head as he sat in his study, surrounded by the fragments of a life he had deliberately abandoned. The twins were asleep in the living room, Valeria keeping watch nearby. Diego, however, had no intention of resting. Instead, he opened his laptop and began searching for answers. Miguel. It took hours of scouring old news articles and corporate records, but the fragments began to form a disturbing picture. Miguel Torres had been embroiled in a bitter battle with their father, Manuel Torres, over the ethics of their family's business empire. One article in particular caught Diego's eye. "Whistleblower or rebel? Miguel Torres challenges Torres Corporation practices." Diego leaned back in his chair, his brow furrowed. He hadn't spoken to Miguel in years by the time the article was published. At the time, he'd dismissed his brother's actions as reckless idealism. But now, looking at the headlines and piecing together the timeline, Diego realized there had been more to Miguel's accusations. Corruption, money laundering, exploitation. These weren't just the grievances of a rebellious son, they were the makings of a conspiracy that could ruin an empire. And Miguel had paid the ultimate price for trying to expose it. The initials on the blanket, MT, seemed to taunt him from across the room. Diego rose from his chair, walking over to the living room where the twins slept. He knelt beside the makeshift cradle and picked up the tattered fabric. His fingers traced the faded gold embroidery. "Manuel Torres," he murmured, the name like ash in his mouth. The weight of his father's legacy pressed heavily on him. He had spent his entire life modeling himself after the man, disciplined, ruthless, uncompromising. And yet, that same legacy had destroyed his brother. Diego clutched the blanket tightly, as though it could provide answers. The twins stirred slightly, one of them letting out a soft whimper. He looked down at their small, peaceful faces and felt a pang of something unfamiliar. Guilt. "Diego?" Valeria's voice broke the silence. She stood in the doorway, her expression carefully neutral, but her eyes probing. "You've been in here for hours. What have you found?" Diego hesitated. He wasn't sure he wanted to voice the thoughts swirling in his mind, but something in Valeria's steady presence made him relent. "Miguel was trying to expose something," he said finally. "Something about the company, about our father." Valeria stepped closer, her arms crossed. "And you think that's why he was killed?" Diego nodded. "It's the only explanation that makes sense. He wouldn't have left Isabel and these babies unprotected unless he knew he was in danger." She regarded him carefully, her expression unreadable. "You've always avoided talking about your family, Diego, but maybe it's time you stop running from it." Her words struck a nerve. Diego turned away, his jaw tightening. "You think I don't know that? This mess is already in my house, Valeria. I can't ignore it anymore." Valeria softened, stepping closer. "I wasn't criticizing you. I'm saying you don't have to do this alone." Her words carried an implication he couldn't ignore. Diego turned to her, his eyes narrowing. "You know something," he said, his tone accusatory. "You've always known more about my family than you've let on." For the first time, Valeria looked uneasy. She hesitated, glancing at the twins before meeting his gaze. "I didn't think it was my place," she admitted. "But yes, I knew about Miguel's fight with your father, and I know that Miguel wasn't the only one who had enemies." Diego's expression darkened. "Who else?" Valeria exhaled. "Alejandro Vega." The name sent a chill through Diego. Alejandro Vega was more than just a business rival. He was a man who thrived on chaos and exploitation. If Vega was involved, this wasn't just about a family dispute. This was war. "He and your father were competitors for years," Valeria continued. "But Miguel, he found something that tied Vega to the company's illegal dealings. That's why Vega's a threat now." Diego felt the pieces falling into place, the picture becoming clearer and more damning. The twins weren't just collateral damage in a family drama. They were evidence, living proof of the secrets his father and Vega had tried to bury. Diego stood in the center of the room, the weight of it all pressing down on him. The twins, the blanket, Isabel's desperate plea. It all pointed to one undeniable truth. He couldn't turn his back on this. Not anymore. "Call my lawyer," he said to Valeria, his voice firm, "and start compiling everything we have on Vega." Valeria nodded, her lips pressing into a thin line. "What about the twins?" Diego looked at them, their small forms nestled together, oblivious to the storm brewing around them. His expression softened, but only slightly. "They stay," he said. "For now." He turned away, the initials on the blanket still etched in his mind. Merci. This time, the weight of those letters didn't feel like a burden. They felt like a challenge. The sun had barely risen when the first call came. Diego stood at the window of his study, the city skyline sharp against the pink-tinged sky. The phone vibrated on the desk behind him, persistent and grating, cutting through the morning stillness. He reached for it without urgency, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "Diego Torres," he answered, his voice steady. A low chuckle came from the other end, smooth and deliberate. "Diego, my old friend. It's been too long." Diego's grip on the phone tightened. "Alejandro." Alejandro Vega's voice carried the kind of false charm that made Diego's skin crawl. "I hear you've been digging. I must say I'm disappointed. You've always been smarter than this." Diego didn't respond immediately, letting the silence speak for him. His mind raced, not with fear, but with calculated resolve. "If you've called to threaten me, Alejandro, you'll have to try harder." The chuckle on the other end darkened. "Oh, Diego, you misunderstand. This isn't a threat. It's advice. Stop before you find yourself in a situation you can't control." Diego's jaw clenched, but his voice remained calm. "Control is something I'm quite familiar with." "Is it?" Alejandro's tone sharpened, laced with menace. "Because, from where I'm standing, it looks like you're juggling more than you can handle. A crumbling legacy, too little burdens. You wouldn't want things to unravel further, would you?" Diego felt the insinuation cut deeper than any direct threat. "Stay away from my family," he said, each word deliberate. "Family," Alejandro mused, as if savoring the word. "A curious concept for someone like you, but very well, Diego. I'll leave you to your priorities. Just remember, curiosity killed the cat." The line went dead, leaving Diego staring at the phone in his hand. The room felt colder, as though Alejandro's words had leached the warmth from it. Diego set the phone down, his mind already moving to the next step. If Alejandro thought fear would deter him, he had miscalculated. Later that morning, Diego found himself in the living room with the twins. The chaos of the past days had turned his once immaculate home into a battlefield of toys, bottles, and crumpled blankets. One of the twins gurgled from the floor, kicking their tiny legs in the air. Diego crouched down, watching them with a mix of curiosity and reluctance. He reached out hesitantly, lifting the child into his arms. The baby's weight was lighter than he expected, their warmth surprising. For a moment, he simply held them, studying the delicate features, the small hand that curled around his finger. It was an anchor, pulling him into a world he had spent years avoiding. "You're not going to make this easy, are you?" he murmured. The baby's response was a soft coo, a sound that tugged at something buried deep within him. He sighed and placed them back in the cradle, his movements gentler than they had been before. Valeria entered the room, carrying a tray of coffee and a stack of papers. She paused, watching him with an almost imperceptible smile. "You're getting better at that," she said, setting the tray down. "Hardly," Diego replied, straightening. "But I'm trying." "That's more than I thought I'd see from you," Valeria said, her tone light but edged with honesty. She handed him a folder. "Here's what I've compiled on Vega so far. It's not much, but it's enough to know he's watching us closely." Diego took the folder, flipping through its contents. Each page painted a clearer picture of Alejandro's reach, his connections to shadowy deals, and his uncanny ability to keep his hands clean. Diego's fingers tightened on the paper. "He's afraid," Diego said, almost to himself. "That's why he called. He thinks I'll back down." "Will you?" Valeria asked, her gaze steady. Diego closed the folder with a sharp motion. "No." Valeria nodded, her expression unreadable. "Then we'll need to move carefully. He's not the kind of man who plays fair." "I'm not interested in playing," Diego said. He walked to the window, his silhouette framed by the morning light. "I've spent my life avoiding this mess, pretending it wasn't mine to deal with. But now it's in my house, in my arms." He glanced at the twins, their small forms nestled together. If Vega wants a fight, he'll get one. That night, Diego sat in his study, poring over documents and assembling a strategy. He was no longer just safeguarding a legacy, he was defending a future. As he worked, the sound of soft cries reached him. He rose, leaving the papers behind, and went to the nursery. One of the twins was awake, their tiny fists waving in protest. Diego lifted them, holding them close as he walked to the window. The city lights shimmered in the distance, a reminder of the battles yet to come. "It's not just about me anymore," he whispered, more to himself than the child. "It's about you, and I won't let him take that away." The late afternoon sunlight spilled into the living room, casting warm hues across the polished floors and the clutter of Diego's new reality. Toys, bottles, and blankets still occupied corners of the room, but they no longer felt out of place. The twins napped soundly in their cradles, their gentle breaths filling the air with a rhythmic calm. A knock at the door disrupted the quiet. Diego, seated on the couch with a stack of documents on Vega's operations, looked up sharply. Valeria appeared in the hallway, a questioning glance exchanged between them. Diego rose, his step steady but guarded, and opened the door. Isabel stood on the threshold, her face pale but resolute. She clutched a satchel close to her chest, her expression a blend of determination and guilt. Without waiting for an invitation, she stepped inside, her eyes scanning the room until they landed on the twins. A faint, relieved smile touched her lips before she turned back to Diego. "We need to talk," she said simply. Diego closed the door behind her, folding his arms. "You have a habit of showing up unannounced. And you have a habit of making things harder than they need to be," Isabel shot back, though her voice lacked venom. She glanced at Valeria, who lingered in the background, and then back at Diego. "This is about what you don't know. About Miguel. About everything." Diego motioned for her to sit, his expression unreadable. "Then start talking." Isabel hesitated, her hands fidgeting with the strap of her satchel. "You know Miguel and I were on the run," she began, "but you don't know why." Diego's gaze didn't waver. "Because he found something that could bring down Vega." She nodded. "Yes, but it wasn't just about Vega. It was about our father too. Miguel discovered documents, proof that Manuel Torres was involved in the same illegal operations Vega now controls. Money laundering, black market deals, even bribery. Miguel was going to expose it all." Diego felt his chest tighten. The weight of his father's legacy bore down on him anew, but he forced himself to stay composed. "And that's why they killed him?" Isabel's voice trembled slightly. "Yes. Miguel tried to go public, but Vega's people got to him first. He knew they would come after me too, so he sent me away with the twins. He told me to find you, that you'd know what to do." Diego leaned back, his jaw tight. The pieces of the puzzle clicked into place with an almost cruel clarity. His father's empire, built on lies and greed, had claimed the life of his brother, and now Vega, the inheritor of that corruption, sought to erase any trace of the truth. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" he asked, his tone sharp but not unkind. Isabel looked down, her fingers gripping the strap tightly. "Because I didn't trust you. I didn't know if you'd protect them or hand them over to save yourself. But after everything, I see now that you care." Diego's gaze softened just slightly. "They're my family. Of course I care." The silence that followed was heavy, filled with unsaid words. Isabel reached into her satchel and pulled out a folder, its edges worn and frayed. She placed it on the coffee table between them. "These are the documents Miguel managed to copy before he was killed," she said, Names, accounts, everything. It's not complete, but it's enough to prove Vega's connection to our father's operations. Diego picked up the folder, his fingers brushing against the brittle paper. As he skimmed through the contents, the enormity of what Miguel had been fighting for struck him. His brother had given everything to right their father's wrongs, and now it fell to Diego to finish what he had started. "Thank you," Diego said quietly, his voice carrying a weight Isabel hadn't expected. She blinked, her guarded expression softening. "I didn't do it for you," she replied, but there was no edge in her tone. She glanced toward the twins, who were beginning to stir. "I did it for them." Diego followed her gaze, his chest tightening. He closed the folder and set it aside, rising to his feet. "Then it's time we make sure this ends here." Isabel stood as well, studying him carefully. "You've changed," she said after a moment. "The Diego I remember wouldn't have taken this on." "The Diego you remember didn't have much to fight for," he admitted, his eyes meeting hers. "Now I do." Her lips quirked into a faint smile, one that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Then let's make sure Miguel's sacrifice wasn't for nothing." Diego nodded, his resolve firm. As Isabel moved to check on the twins, Valeria stepped into the room, her expression expectant. "Call the lawyer," Diego said to her. "Tell him we're going public with this." Valeria hesitated, her brow furrowing. "Are you sure? Vega won't back down easily." Diego's gaze hardened, his voice steady. "Neither will I." For the first time in years, he felt clarity. Painful, yes, but pure. He wasn't just reclaiming his family's name, he was protecting its future. And for that, he would risk everything. The quiet night was broken by the faint sound of footsteps. Diego, sitting in his study, looked up sharply. Something was wrong. The house was too still, the kind of stillness that screamed danger. He rose from his chair, his senses on high alert. From the nursery, the twins let out a soft cry, a sound Diego had grown attuned to. But this time, it wasn't a simple whimper. The noise was laced with unease, like a warning. Diego moved quickly toward the nursery, his pulse quickening. Before he reached the door, the sound of breaking glass shattered the silence. He froze, his mind racing. Intruders. Alejandro's veiled threat earlier that week now crystallized into reality. Diego turned on his heel, moving with purpose towards the nearest drawer in the hall, where he kept a pistol locked away. "Valeria," he called, his voice low but firm. She appeared at the top of the stairs, her face tense. "What's happening?" "We're not alone," Diego said, his tone leaving no room for doubt. "Get to the twins. Lock the door, now." Valeria nodded, disappearing down the hall toward the nursery as Diego retrieved the weapon. The weight of it in his hand felt foreign but necessary. He crept toward the living room, the shadows stretching long and unfamiliar in the dim light. A figure moved near the front door, their silhouette sharp against the faint glow of the streetlights outside. Diego took a deep breath, his grip tightening. "Get out of my house," he commanded, his voice cutting through the tension like steel. The intruder paused, turning slightly toward him. "Mr. Torres," the man said, his voice calm but dripping with malice. "This isn't personal. Just hand over the babies, and we'll leave." Diego's jaw clenched. "You'll leave now, or you won't leave at all." The man chuckled darkly, stepping closer. "Brave words, but we both know you don't want this to get messy." Behind him, more movement. Diego's eyes darted toward the sound, spotting a second figure sneaking toward the nursery. His stomach twisted. He couldn't be in two places at once. Inside the nursery, Valeria stood with her back to the door, her arms wrapped protectively around one of the twins. The other rested in a portable bassinet nearby. She locked the door, her hands trembling slightly, but her eyes were fierce. The sound of muffled footsteps outside made her heart race. "Come on," she whispered to herself, glancing toward the window. Escape wasn't an option. The drop was too far. Her gaze flicked to the bassinet. The twins stirred, their soft cries growing louder. A sharp knock on the door sent a jolt through her. "Open up," a voice called, low and menacing. Valeria's mind raced. She grabbed a heavy lamp from the nightstand, holding it like a weapon. The knocking grew louder, more insistent. The door rattled as the intruder began forcing it open. Diego heard the noise and acted on instinct. He fired a warning shot into the air, the sound reverberating through the house. The man in front of him froze, his hands raising slightly in mock surrender. "Tell your men to back off," Diego growled, his voice filled with a fury he didn't recognize in himself. The man hesitated, then nodded. "Stand down," he barked toward the hallway. For a moment, the noise stopped. Diego's shoulders relaxed just slightly, but the tension in the air didn't dissipate. He kept his gun trained on the intruder. "You think this is over?" the man said, his tone almost amused. "Vega doesn't like loose ends." Diego's expression hardened. "Tell Vega this. If he wants to come after my family, he'd better come himself." The man smirked but didn't reply. The door to the nursery crashed open with a force that sent Valeria stumbling back. A masked intruder stepped inside, his imposing figure filling the small room. Valeria tightened her grip on the lamp she held, her knuckles white with tension. Behind her, the twins let out panicked cries, their small voices piercing through the heavy air. The man moved forward with cold efficiency, his eyes locked on the children. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be," he growled. Valeria didn't wait. With a ferocity she didn't know she possessed, she swung the lamp with all her strength. The crash of glass and the man's grunt of pain as the lamp connected with his shoulder gave her a flicker of hope. But he recovered quickly, his large frame lunging toward her. Meanwhile, Diego stood in the hallway, his pistol aimed at the second intruder who had entered the living room moments earlier. The man smirked, his calm demeanor only fueling Diego's anger. "You won't pull that trigger," the intruder taunted, his voice low and mocking. Diego didn't answer. Instead, his focus sharpened as another figure emerged from the shadows behind the first. His mind raced, two men, both blocking his way to the nursery. A sudden sound behind him, a creak on the staircase, drew his attention. Before he could react, a third man lunged at him from the side, tackling him to the ground. The pistol flew from Diego's hand, clattering across the marble floor. Struggling against the weight pinning him down, Diego managed to throw an elbow into the man's ribs, creating just enough space to push him off. Gasping, he scrambled toward the fallen pistol, his fingers inches away from the weapon, when another pair of boots appeared in his peripheral vision. A sharp crack echoed through the room, and the intruder staggered backward, clutching his arm. Diego grabbed the pistol, spinning toward the source of the shot. Standing at the base of the stairs, a determined figure lowered a small handgun, her gaze fierce. "Isabel?" Diego breathed, his voice tinged with both surprise and relief. In the nursery, the masked man cornered Valeria. She braced herself for his attack, her heart hammering in her chest, when the door behind him slammed open. Isabel appeared, her stance steady, and her weapon raised. "Move, and I won't miss next time," she said, her voice cold and unwavering. The man hesitated, his eyes narrowing as he assessed the situation. But the sight of Diego stepping into the room, his pistol aimed squarely at the intruder, seemed to sway his decision. Slowly, he raised his hands. Valeria exhaled shakily, her grip on the broken lamp loosening. She glanced at Isabel, a flicker of gratitude crossing her face. "Get the twins," Diego said, his voice steady but urgent. "We're not done yet." Downstairs, The remaining intruders regrouped in the living room. Diego, Isabel, and Valeria descended the staircase, the twins now securely cradled in Valeria's arms. Diego's eyes swept the room, taking in the chaos of overturned furniture and shattered glass. "This ends tonight," Isabel said, her voice resolute. She turned to Diego, her expression unflinching. "We can't keep running or hiding. Vega won't stop until we take the fight to him." Diego met her gaze, the weight of her words sinking in. For years, he had avoided confrontation, choosing to retreat behind the walls of his carefully constructed empire. But tonight had shown him the cost of inaction. "You're right," he said finally, his tone grim. "It's time to end this." Valeria stepped forward, her face pale but determined. "We'll need more than just us. Vega has resources, connections, and we have the truth," Isabel interjected. She held up a small USB drive, the faint glint of its metallic surface catching the light. "This has everything, transactions, correspondence, enough to bury him." Diego's eyes narrowed. "If we're going to use this, we need to be smart. We can't just expose him without protecting ourselves." "Then we start planning," Isabel said, her voice steady. "Tonight, we survived. Tomorrow, we fight." The room fell into a tense silence as the three of them began to strategize, their resolve hardening with every word exchanged. The twins' soft breaths, now calm, filled the background, a reminder of what they were fighting for. The mansion, though bruised and battered, stood as a fortress for now. But it was clear to Diego, Isabel, and Valeria, the battle with Alejandro Vega had only just begun. The conference room of the Torres corporate headquarters was filled with a tense energy. Reporters from every major outlet jostled for position, their cameras and microphones angled toward the raised podium at the front. On the stage, a massive screen displayed the Torres family crest, its intricate design a symbol of power that now carried both scandal and intrigue. Diego Torres stood off to the side, his expression unreadable as he scanned the crowd. This moment was calculated, orchestrated to perfection. It wasn't just a fight for his family. It was a war for truth, for justice, and for control of a legacy tarnished by corruption. Valeria stepped beside him, her demeanor calm but resolute. "They're ready," she said softly. Diego gave a single nod, his gaze hardening as he walked to the podium. The murmur of voices hushed instantly as the cameras zoomed in, capturing every detail of his poised figure. He placed his hands firmly on the edges of the lectern, his fingers brushing against the crisp edges of the documents he had brought as evidence. "Thank you all for coming," Diego began, his voice steady but resonant. "Today I stand before you not as a corporate leader, but as a son, a brother, and a man who has carried the weight of his family's actions for too long." The words hung in the air, deliberate and heavy. A flicker of surprise crossed the faces in the audience. This wasn't the detached businessman they were used to seeing. For decades, the Torres name has been synonymous with power and influence. But beneath that surface lies a truth that has been buried by those who sought to protect their interests at any cost. Diego turned toward the screen, motioning to Valeria. She clicked a remote, and the screen flickered to life, displaying a series of documents and photos, financial records, wire transfers, names and signatures, each piece a thread in the web of corruption that had ensnared the Torres family empire. "These are the actions of my father, Manuel Torres," Diego continued, his voice unwavering, "and of his associate, Alejandro Vega, a man who has built his wealth on the suffering of others." Gasps rippled through the room as more images appeared, photographs of impoverished workers in unsafe conditions, accounts of money laundering schemes, and reports of whistleblowers silenced by violence. Diego's jaw tightened as he spoke, his voice tinged with the anger and guilt he had carried for years. My brother, Miguel Torres, tried to expose these crimes, Diego said, his tone softening but losing none of its impact. And for his courage, he was silenced. His death was no accident. It was a warning, a message that no one crosses Vega or my father without consequences. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the room. The reporters furiously scribbled notes, their cameras capturing every flicker of emotion on his face. Diego straightened, his hands gripping the lectern. "But I refuse to be silent," he declared. "This is not just about the past. It's about the future, about ensuring that the Torres name stands for justice, not exploitation." Valeria advanced the presentation, revealing a final slide. A recorded phone conversation between Alejandro Vega and one of his associates. The audio, crackling but clear, left no doubt about Vega's involvement in the cover-ups and Miguel's murder. The room erupted into chaos. Reporters shouted questions, their voices overlapping as the story of a lifetime unfolded before them. Diego stepped back from the podium, his face calm, but his eyes sharp. He had delivered the truth, and now the world would judge. Hours later, Diego returned to the mansion. The silence of his home was a stark contrast to the frenzied media storm he had left behind. In the nursery, Isabel sat in a rocking chair, humming softly as she cradled one of the twins. The other slept soundly in the bassinet nearby. Diego leaned against the doorway, watching her. For a moment, he said nothing, letting the quiet warmth of the scene wash over him. "You were brilliant today," Isabel said without looking up, her voice filled with quiet pride. Diego approached the bassinet, gazing down at the sleeping twins. Their tiny faces were peaceful, untouched by the storm raging around them. He reached out, his hand resting gently on the edge of the blanket that covered them, a blanket still embroidered with the initials MT. "I've spent my life building walls," Diego said softly, his voice barely audible. "Walls to keep people out, to keep myself safe. But these two—" He paused, his hand brushing the baby's tiny fist. "They've torn them down." Isabel smiled, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "They've given you something worth fighting for." Diego nodded, his gaze never leaving the twins. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with tension and anticipation. The walls, lined with dark wood and adorned with crests of justice, bore witness to countless battles of law and morality. But today, the stakes were higher. Alejandro Vega, the man whose name had become synonymous with greed and corruption, sat at the defendant's table. His usual air of arrogance had been replaced by a cold, calculating silence. On the opposite side, Diego Torres sat beside Isabel and Valeria, their presence a united front. Diego's expression was unreadable, his sharp suit and composed demeanor masking the storm of emotions brewing beneath the surface. He had fought too hard and lost too much to let Vega walk free. The judge entered, and the room rose. As everyone settled, the prosecutor, a formidable woman named Elena Chavez, stood, her confidence palpable. She began with a calm but piercing opening statement. "Your Honor, members of the jury, we are here today to expose the actions of a man who thought he could operate above the law. Alejandro Vega has exploited, corrupted, and silenced those who dared to stand in his way. But today, his actions are no longer hidden. Today, we bring the truth into the light." Eleanor turned toward the jury, her voice firm. "The evidence you will see and hear over the course of this trial is undeniable. Financial records, witness testimonies, recorded conversations. Each piece forms a puzzle that reveals the calculated greed and malice of the defendant." She glanced briefly at Vega before continuing. "But this trial is not just about justice for those harmed by his actions. It is about ensuring that no one, no matter how powerful, is above the law. As the trial unfolded, the evidence Diego and his team had painstakingly gathered was presented with precision. Financial records were displayed on screens, showing Vega's illegal transactions. Witnesses, some of whom had risked their lives to testify, detailed the threats and coercion they had faced under Vega's orders. But the most damning moment came when Elena introduced the audio recording of Vega plotting Miguel's downfall. The courtroom fell silent as the recording played. Vega's voice, cold and calculating, filled the room. "Miguel Torres is becoming a problem. Make sure he understands the cost of crossing me, permanently." Diego's hands clenched into fists, his nails digging into his palms. Beside him, Isabel reached out, her touch grounding him. The jury's faces were a mix of shock and disgust, the weight of the evidence settling heavily. When the defense tried to discredit the recording, Valeria stepped forward as a key witness. Her testimony, delivered with unwavering resolve, detailed the lengths Vega had gone to silence Miguel and protect his empire. As the trial neared its end, Vega's defense crumbled. The final blow came when the judge allowed a surprise witness, an accountant who had worked for Vega for years. Fearful for his life, the man had remained silent until the press conference made it clear that Vega's power was waning. Under oath, the accountant revealed the extent of Vega's illegal activities. "He controlled everything," the man said, his voice trembling. "Every bribe, every cover-up." Miguel Torres found the records, and that's when Vega decided he had to be dealt with. The prosecutor's final question was simple. "And do you believe Mr. Vega orchestrated the death of Miguel Torres?" The witness nodded, tears welling in his eyes. "Yes, without a doubt." When the jury delivered their verdict, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. "We find the defendant, Alejandro Vega, guilty on all counts." A collective exhale swept through the room. Vega's face remained stoic, but his shoulders sagged slightly, a crack in the armor of his bravado. The judge's sentence followed swiftly. Life imprisonment, without the possibility of parole. Diego allowed himself a moment of satisfaction as Vega was led away in handcuffs. Justice had been served, but the victory was bittersweet. The fight had cost him his brother and nearly destroyed his family. Yet, as he glanced at Isabel and Valeria, he realized it had also brought them closer together. Later that evening, Diego and Isabel stood outside the courthouse. The cool evening air a welcome contrast to the stifling tension of the trial. Valeria joined them, her expression both tired and relieved. "It's over," Isabel said softly, her voice carrying both relief and exhaustion. Diego nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "It's over for him. But for us, it's just the beginning." Valeria placed a hand on his shoulder. "You did the right thing, Diego. Miguel would be proud." Diego turned to her, his expression softer than she had seen in years. "We all did." As they walked toward the waiting car, Diego felt the weight of the past begin to lift. Years passed, and the Torres mansion transformed from a symbol of rigid isolation into a home filled with warmth and laughter. The sprawling estate, once silent and cold, now echoed with the sounds of life. The once pristine rooms bore the marks of a family. A toy left on the floor, a stray crayon marking the edge of a table, and the scent of freshly baked cookies drifting through the air. Diego Torres, now in his 60s, sat on the veranda overlooking the garden. His hair had turned silver, and the lines on his face spoke of a life well lived. But his posture was relaxed, his expression calm. In his lap rested a well-worn book, its pages dog-eared from years of storytelling to two now vibrant children. "Grandpa, look!" a boy's voice called out, breaking the serenity of the morning. One of the twins, now a lively 8-year-old named Mateo, ran toward him, holding a small bird's nest he had found. His sister, Clara, followed close behind, her hands cupped around a flower she had carefully picked. Diego chuckled, setting the book aside. "What have you got there, Mateo?" he asked, his voice warm. "A nest. I think it fell from that tree," Mateo said, pointing to a nearby oak. "Can we put it back?" Diego nodded, rising slowly. "Of course, but we have to be careful not to scare the birds." Clara held out her flower. "And this is for you, Grandpa." Diego took the flower, his heart swelling. "Thank you, Clara. It's beautiful." As he helped Mateo place the nest back in the tree, Isabel stepped out onto the veranda, carrying a tray of lemonade. Her hair was tied back, and her face glowed with the quiet contentment of a life rebuilt. "You've got them climbing trees again, haven't you?" she teased. Diego turned, a playful grin on his face. "I'm teaching them to be fearless." Isabel laughed, setting the tray down on a nearby table. "They don't need much help with that." Valeria joined them moments later, wiping her hands on a kitchen towel. She had taken to running the household with her characteristic efficiency, but her demeanor had softened over the years. She carried a plate of cookies, setting it beside the lemonade. "You're spoiling them, Valeria," Diego said, though his tone was far from disapproving. "They deserve it," Valeria replied with a smile. "And so do you." As the sun climbed higher in the sky, the family gathered around the table on the veranda. Diego listened as the twins recounted their latest adventures, their voices filled with excitement. Isabel chimed in with stories of her own, her bond with her children evident in every word. Valeria sat quietly, watching the scene with a content smile. Diego caught her eye and raised his glass in a silent toast, a gesture of gratitude for her unwavering loyalty and love through the years. When the twins finished their snacks, they darted back into the garden, their laughter trailing behind them. Diego leaned back in his chair, his gaze following them. The garden, once a place of solitude, now felt alive, a testament to how far they had all come. "Do you ever think about the past?" Isabel asked softly, breaking the comfortable silence. Diego turned to her, his expression thoughtful. "I do," he admitted, "but it doesn't weigh on me the way it used to. The past brought us here, Isabel. It gave us this." Isabel nodded, her eyes shining. "And we're stronger because of it." Valeria reached for Diego's hand, her touch gentle but firm. "You've built something beautiful, Diego. Something worth holding on to." Diego looked at her, then at Isabel, and finally at the garden where Mateo and Clara played. A smile spread across his face, genuine and unguarded. "We all did," he said. As evening fell, the family gathered in the living room. Diego read aloud from the book in his lap, his voice steady and comforting. Mateo and Clara leaned against him, their eyelids growing heavy. Isabel sat nearby, her head resting against Valeria's shoulder, the two women sharing a quiet moment of peace. When the twins finally fell asleep, Diego carried them to their room, tucking them in with a tenderness that had once seemed impossible for him. He lingered for a moment, watching their peaceful faces, before turning off the light and closing the door. Back in the living room, Valeria handed him a cup of tea. "You're a natural, you know," she said. Diego chuckled, settling into the armchair beside her. "It only took me a lifetime." Valeria smiled, resting her head against his shoulder. "A lifetime well spent." Diego gazed out the window, the moonlight casting a soft glow over the garden. The storm that had once defined his life was now a distant memory. In its place was a sense of hope, of purpose, and of love. And for the first time, Diego Torres knew he had everything he needed.